to this session, the philanthropy session around, or the philanthropy co-creation session around the Social Innovation Summit. As I was saying to those of you who weren't in the introduction session, the three lessons we've learned from this disruption that we've experienced is one, that our capacity to cope and our capacity to adapt, whether it's us or our partners, is to a large measure dependent on our tech readiness, if you will. That lesson, I think, has been learned across the board. I know when we did our survey in July, this was one of the key findings from NGOs, where they said, we now get it. We now realize why we need to make these investments. Of course, for many of them, it was even harder to do now that the pandemic was upon them. The second learning we looked at was we can also see more starkly now what the consequences of this divide are, of who is able to access learning and who is not, who is able to figure out the information on how to get treatment or stay safe or take precautions, and who is not, who is able to work from home and who is not, whose wealth is just burgeoned as a consequence of the pandemic and who has found themselves destitute. So the third learning, of course, is across the board. Many of you will have seen this with your own organizations and partners, is that the potential that the technology offers is huge. I mean, people are delivering services on a scale they had never imagined, to target groups that they had never considered, in parts of the country and parts of the world that were never on their map. And so there's suddenly a realization, not just that the technology is critical to our being able to maintain operations or maintain business continuity, but that there's actually huge new vistas that it's opening up. There's also, of course, the downsides of technology, which again, we're finding NGOs are woefully underprepared on, which is this whole area of data security, information security, surveillance, privacy. All of it is virtually non-existent in the sector, and nobody's sort of preemptively made those investments. Who knows, is that going to change, or is it actually going to get worse, that we're going to have more women's reproductive health data sitting in the public domain in Excel sheets rather than less? So the purpose of this session really is to try and understand, from all of you, what your own experience has been, whether as a provider of technology or a provider of support to grantees so that they can cope on the technological front, or how you yourself have adapted and what you've learned on the technology front. So I thought we could go quickly around the room and first just do a round of introductions. And many of you know each other. It's a small, sadly, too small a group that cares about these issues. So a quick introduction, just telling us who you are and which organization you work with, and give us some sense of the, what your philosophy or your approach to making investments in technology for yourself and your partners is. I'm going to start with Vidya because she's at the top left of my screen.
Thanks, Ingrid. I think, I'm the CEO of Aided Gift Foundation. We're a grant-making foundation, but along with that, we've always believed and provided capacity building support to our NGOs. I think what the pandemic has sort of exposed, in a sense, is a sort of a rethink on one aspect of our capacity building support, which is in relation to technology. I think we had placed a lot of emphasis in the initial years on visioning, strategy, financial planning. And then simultaneously, there was a lot of eagerness around HR systems, people planning, and hiring. But at the same time, I think a lot of demand, as it were, from the NGOs was really around building financial sustainability and helping them sort of create frameworks around fundraising. Um, our effort was, however, to push our fourth vertical, which was really the systems processes bit, which was really around building great, good accounting and reporting systems, donor reporting systems, as well as MIS, so that they could use that not only into reporting but into also building program improvement. I think the hardware aspect and some aspects of the software for on the technology side is something that escaped us completely, and I think that just got exposed completely in the midst of the pandemic, because as a foundation which is so closely attached to a corporate, actually we moved seamlessly, as it were. Our Microsoft Teams, was, we had already been trained in January, because we were doing a transition and upgrade of our systems. We understand business continuity planning. We understand InfoSec. We need to report to regulators on information security. So we understood all of that, but we never translated that into trying to figure out what the equivalent was for the sector. So I think that got really exposed, and therefore, sort of briefly, there were two aspects that really hit us hard. One is even the lack of basic hardware in a lot of our NGOs, laptops, LAN systems, access to Wi-Fi, internet, and the rest. And the other is really on the fact that the systems development around reporting and data security had not evolved to a level of sophistication. It was still quite rudimentary around data capture and some amount of data analysis, but not really around how do you massage this data and how you protect this data.
Thanks, Vidya. I'm going to ask you to go next, Rama.
Okay, I'm Rama. I'm the Director General of the WPP India Foundation. So again, so the space that we're in is in terms of education to livelihood, and we've always looked at ourselves in terms of leading digital literacy. So I think some of the things, I sort of identify with a lot of things that Vidya mentioned in terms of saying some parts of it moved on very seamlessly. So I think as a foundation, we moved very seamlessly onto online, and we were able to move almost about 70% of our programs online pretty seamlessly, because they're part of a much larger network where the entire backend and the hardware is all taken care of. But I think one of the things that we realize is that we keep talking about digital literacy, but I think the pandemic sort of exposed the fact that we weren't really ready for it. And I think the good thing that we sort of figured is that it almost pushed us into doing it. So I think a lot of the things that we wanted to do and we talked about doing, we ended up doing only because we didn't have the option. We didn't have access to our kids. We didn't have access to any of the work that we wanted to do. So a couple of things, for instance, I think our programs moved on seamlessly. We are again a grant giving entity. So we found that a lot of the partners that we work with who've always said that they wanted to be sort of digitally enabled and, but somehow we never really got down to it. They would constantly manage parallel, physical sort of, if it's data, if it's impact. So yes, I mean, we would get a quarterly reporting, in terms of a presentation on an Excel, but then we knew that there were data sheets maintained, which were physical. So I think this particular, I think the pandemic just sort of forced us to move everything online, and with a lot less resistance and a lot more speed. And I think the best thing is we were all willing to sort of try and make mistakes, because it was a new sort of starting point for everybody. So I think we all struggled together. And we were all willing to make a lot of mistakes, which I think was nice, because I think the NGOs and we were learning together at the same time, and there was no difference in anybody at any stage. I think that hugely helped. I also think that as an organization, though we're very close to the parent company, this was a time that we really pulled in a lot of the resources to sort of help us jumpstart the entire capacity building with our partners. Just to give an example, for instance, impact is a huge area of focus for us. I think we spend disproportionately on impact and research and digital. I mean, really disproportionately. We've always wanted to have impact assessment tools and do away with physical, research. While we always, we realize that qualitative research cannot be substituted, but quantitatively, because we evaluate every single program every single day, we wanted to sort of move that entire thing online and digitize it. But this forced us into closing our conversation with IIT and Tata Trust, where we've been having a conversation, but we didn't really close it. But this sort of forced us to close that conversation. We've moved into building the app and we're sort of testing it. And one of the things that I think helped us is because we pulled in, the head of digital strategy for the entire WPP group. We pulled in the CEO who heads the digital company. And I also think that because we had the think tank, we were able to do it on our own. Even though as a foundation, we're digitally geared, we wouldn't have been able to do it if we hadn't been able to pull in the right resources from the parent company to sort of help us jumpstart the entire process. So I think that sort of hugely helped.
Thanks, Rama. And I'm going to go to Nisha.
Hi, everyone. I am Nisha Dhawan. I am the country director for India at Empower the Emerging Markets Foundation. So I think our organizational journey has been very, very similar to what's been mentioned thus far. We actually have staff in 6 or 7 geographies. So we have been, digitally inclined or Zoom inclined or Microsoft Teams inclined for many, many years. So from that perspective, I think it's been a fairly easy transition within the actual organization. I think what's been tough is that when you are, as a country director, there's a lot of strategies that involve sort of democratized decision-making and, really looking at team members to weigh in on priorities. I think that's been really a little bit more difficult. When you're used to being in the same location, when you're used to having FaceTime with staff or in-country staff, and that gets taken away. So I think that transition was a little bit tough, but in terms of connecting globally, in terms of our strategic priorities, communicating, that was fairly easy. But in terms of our actual grant making, what I found was really interesting was in mid-March, so a week prior to the lockdown, we made the decision to start making emergency grants to our grantee partners globally, not only in India, but globally, as direct and immediate response to the COVID crisis. And that could take any form. It could take the form of keeping your lights on in your organization or paying your staff or distributing aid. But remarkably and resoundingly, several of our grantee partners said we need to come up with a business continuity plan to move our modules online, to, let's get out of make our classrooms virtual. So a lot of the thinking and the thought partnering with our grantee partners was very much around the digitization of the work that they were doing. And I'm really, really happy to say that several of our grantee partners in India have made that transition really, really effectively. And I just want to make one more point, which is, something that I've been grappling with, which is around, really looking at power in relation to technology, because it's one thing to say we're going to fund the provision of tablets, we're going to fund the provision of cell phones, or we're going to bring all of our modules online. But it's a completely different thing to acknowledge the power relations that actually govern the use of technology. And for us, especially given that most of the people that we operate, like most of the program participants, amongst our grantee partners are adolescent girls. So they're contending with barriers around lack of access to technology, around lack of access to cell phones or smartphones, because either they simply cannot afford them, or even if they can, or even if they're provided to them, they do not have the agency to be able to say, I am attending this online class, right? And that agency of actual use over a tablet or over a cell phone lies with their father or with their brothers or with other stakeholders and power brokers. So I think that's kind of, on one hand, we're building a bicycle and riding it at the same time in relation to increased digitization around a lot of our grants and with our grantee partners. But I think the biggest issue that we're grappling with and continue to grapple with is around agency and power for technology use. And I think that in order to have this discussion most effectively, it is the recognition of that, very real, very palpable power dynamic that exists in the digital space.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm just going to introduce my colleague Pramit. Pramit, if you want to show us your face. Pramit is essentially going to be taking notes and using the sort of the whiteboard functionality of this. So some of what you're trying to say gets captured, and so we can come back to it once we've done this round robin. So Pramit, if you want to activate the whiteboard. Moving now to Paresh.
Thanks, Ingrid. I think maybe I'll spend some time talking not so much about what Vidya and Rama have touched upon, which is from an organization and internal perspective. So by way of introduction, my name is Paresh Parasnis. I head the Piramal Foundation. And unlike, I think, the three earlier colleagues who spoke, we are an operating foundation. We work in education, in primary healthcare, and in safe drinking water. I think what I'll share, Ingrid, is really our experience about what has it meant to really implement our programs effectively across the country and in remote corners of the country, which is where our teams are based, in more than 20 odd states across the country. I think the pandemic really brought upon us the opportunity, let's say in something like healthcare and in education, to really contribute very meaningfully at scale. So to give examples, two examples specifically, in education, because schools have been closed, our team really pivoted its entire strategy to start focusing on senior citizens in the 25 aspirational districts that we work in. And this was not doing everything by ourselves, but working with nonprofit partners, working with volunteers. And today that program has been expanded by Niti Aayog to 112 districts. So we're working with 150 NGO partners with close to 150,000 volunteers, and of course our own people in the 25 districts. But it has reached more than 2 million senior citizens. And the focus was to ensure that they understood what COVID appropriate behavior was, to help them with their daily requirements, pension, medicines, ration, whatever, and in case they were affected by the virus, in supporting them. I think that obviously meant that we had to really start using off-the-shelf technology to connect with these nonprofit partners, to enable training, to enable technical assistance, to support the volunteers through social media and otherwise. So I think we, in that sense, learned a new way of how to work with small products, off-the-shelf products, but really integrate them seamlessly in a manner that you can quickly scale up in large geographies. The other was in healthcare, where we operate 7 health helplines with state governments. And in the last 6 months, we have seen that in these helplines, which used to handle about 25 to 30,000 calls a day, which is roughly about 750,000 calls a month, over the last 6 months, we have handled just for COVID more than 1 million calls. And that's just for COVID. And which really meant that we had to learn very quickly as to the scalability of our own technology that was in use in these helplines, but also scale up the backend in terms of getting people, training people, equipping them, and getting them, because you're talking about health advice, so you can't go wrong. So I think that was one large thing that we understood very well during this pandemic. I think the second point I would share is really uh, that over the last couple of years, I would say, the foundation has really been developing technology assets, especially in water and in healthcare, uh, and which we believe can be offered as public good. Something that need not be restricted only for our operation, but can be offered as a public good. So again, to give an example, the work that we've been doing in healthcare is to create an electronic health record platform that works in primary healthcare, which today is not digitally in that sense inclusive, but really capture that data at a primary healthcare, but also at the same time can plug into a government program like Ayushman Bharat. So we have over this period actually been testing our entire technology stack for NDHM compliance to ensure that, Ingrid, a lot of stuff that you spoke about on data privacy, consent architecture for people who are unable to read and write, especially in rural areas, it still becomes a practical way. And I think it's forced us to start thinking about and really stepping out of the box to really say what can work and what can work well, especially in terms of data privacy and consent architecture. So that was one aspect. The second is, I think, understanding the amount of data that we end up collecting, which in healthcare tends to be a pretty large, uh, I mean, by volume. Just to give you an instance, wherever we have implemented this software called Amrit, we today have close to 5 million patient records. And we are now working with Rockefeller to really say how can we bring analytics and insights into large data, big data, in a manner that it can help governments design their programs or design their policies far better. So I think that's something that I would say we have pushed ourselves on. And the third dimension I would just want to leave as a thought at this point is like Vidya, I think about 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago, the foundation became an independent foundation. So we are not a corporate foundation anymore, right? So the Piramal Foundation, as a philanthropic foundation, we kind of reviewed our entire governance architecture, and we, over the last 2 years, have had a compliance committee, an advisory committee for finance and compliance, and which has really pushed us on things like data privacy and what are we doing to be in tune with the latest regulations that the country is seeing. So I think that's been a learning, I would say, not yet there, but really understanding how data regulations are evolving. What does data privacy mean? Personal data, non-personal data, and so on and so forth. And really relooking at our practices on how we store and use data. I think that was a point that you brought up, Ingrid, and absolutely critical, especially for all of us who handle large pools of data. That becomes very important. So I think I would say technology from a program implementation, program scaling perspective, but really looking at technology as an enabler for scale in a manner that can help other nonprofits and governments, and which is where the public good dimension also came in. So let me just pause there. We can come back to specific dimensions later.
Thanks.
Thank you.
You mentioned Rockefeller. I'm going to call on Deepali.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. And my bandwidth is playing up, so I'm going to be invisible. But just by way of introduction, my name is Deepali. I'm the managing director for the Rockefeller Foundation. I'm based out of Bangkok. We don't have an office in India. There are 4 countries that we have prioritized in the region at this point of time, India being the most important one, where we have most of our programmatic work which is happening. Besides that, China is of great interest to us, as well as Myanmar and Thailand. But having said that, that doesn't exclude if there are opportunities in other countries in the region, we do look at them as well. Again, we've been a 107-year-old foundation, and we take great pride in saying that we are a science-driven philanthropy and really want to constantly stay true to that, and which really means how do we really use data science and technology in all the work that we're trying to do. Our focus pre-COVID was really around 4 programmatic areas: energy, which is all around ending energy poverty, food systems, creating economic opportunities, and looking at the areas of public health. In all these streams of work, innovation was core and innate to everything that we were doing. And also, our approach has always been that we are a small player. So how do we leverage other actors, be it government, be it philanthropy, be it other institutions, to be part of the journey that we're taking on? We use our resources as high risk capital and put them behind big bets that we believe have the chance of succeeding or failing. And if this chances of failing, we'd like to fail fast and move on. I think pre-COVID, what we were doing was that we strongly believed that data and technology needed to be used much more effectively for precision public health. And I won't repeat what has just been said about the work, and we're very excited about the partnership that we have with Piramal as well as with UNICEF, where through effective use of data, we are really able to empower the community health worker. And how can we actually help her to make better use of the data that she is collecting on the ground. So that work was happening pre-COVID. We also had done work around the energy sector, where we developed some effective guides like the e-guide, where MIT had helped us to really see how you could start predicting demand, so that the governments would not just go around building power plants or looking at decentralized renewable energy, but they really had the basis to see which villages, which communities, what kind of a demand would be emerging over a horizon of the next 5 to 10 years. And hence it made sense to either go in for a decentralized option, or it really made sense to extend the grid. We had also seeded 2 entities. One was Atlas AI, which was out of Stanford, where we were really trying to see how geospatial mapping, particularly in Africa around the agriculture systems, could help farmers to be able to look at the weather patterns and really look at how productivity of crops could be increased. And there's been some very exciting work that's been done over there. And then we also seeded an entity along with MasterCard, which is called data.org. So this work had all begun prior to COVID. During COVID, of course, we've really beefed up all the work that we've been doing around data and technology. The first thing that we did was worked with Access Health International, which I think many of you know as a think tank, a global health think tank. And we really were able to capture in real time the data science and the technologies that were used in China, particularly in Wuhan, to address COVID-19. And we used those learnings to kind of inform governments across Asia and Africa. And I think the report that they've generated is really phenomenal. And we've been having global webinars to really see how countries can learn, governments can learn from the work that happened in China. And I know there's a lot of geopolitical issues, especially in the case of India, as to how much of it could be used or couldn't be used. But surprisingly, we had think tank to think tank diplomacy, and the government's kind of behind the scenes, where that exchange happened quite effectively. Going back to data.org, we also launched an inclusive recovery challenge fund, which is a $10 million challenge fund. What we did was, we realized that most folks in Asia, this was a global challenge fund, were not aware of what we were trying to do. So we really did get the message out there, and we are very pleased. I can't make the announcement, but we had, after the US, India was the second country with the highest number of applications. And we do have somebody from India, and we'll be making that announcement in January. So we're super excited about the entity that has received this challenge fund. Besides that, we have been working with a couple of institutions, like the International Innovation Corps. Here we've been doing a lot of work with the Ministry of Electronics and IT on really building the data and tech ecosystem for good, as well as providing support in creating the National Center for Artificial Intelligence. We've also been working with UNDP across the region. And of course, in India, there's some phenomenal examples, particularly in Telangana, where we're really trying to prepare the next gen gov. So how do we look at senior policy makers and really walk them through the journey of what a data and tech lens would look like if they start adopting and adapting it. So, across the region, we have these senior folks coming together, and UNDP has been facilitating all those conversations. We also have an interesting program with Asia Venture Philanthropy Network in India called the Policy Lab Work, where we've identified policy makers across different spectrums. So not just kind of looking at national folks, but also looking at the state level and even at the district level, and really helping them also think through the data and technology solutions that could really help them to build more strategic public-private partnerships. So it's a fellowship, but of course, we have to be careful, because when you're working with senior bureaucrats, how much of that learning space needs to be kind of created as to how they want to be really coming into it has been a fascinating journey, but I won't bore you guys right now around that. We've also been working very closely, both with, I mentioned IIC's work, but we've also been working with IDFC Institute. And of course, we've set up an open data working group with experts advising on issues of data privacy, data storage, anonymization at source, data access, etc. And all this is also fitting in very nicely with our work with my Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. I think what is very important for us is not to do this bespoke work around with different partners, but how then does that come together so that the government's policies can really create that enabling environment that we want to be created in this space. The next piece that I would want to mention is that we've also working very closely with the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth on this whole area of capacity building of civil society actors. And we were very keen that we would start with leaders in the social sector space. National University of Singapore had been contracted by MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth to develop the curriculum. Now, we've had a very challenging time because National University of Singapore is not wanting to go virtual for this capacity building program for senior leadership. They feel very, very strongly that as it is data science and technology, these are tough subjects, and they really want to wait till the time there can be a face-to-face interaction. So that's a little bit of a disappointment for us, because we really don't know when we'll be able to actually get folks from the social sector, particularly we want to be starting with India, over to Singapore. And I'm sure before then there'll be many others who would be able to create the kind of curriculum which is needed, so that we can really be able to shift the mindsets of the social sector space. Because I think as much as we've been saying that there's so much of opportunity around data science for social good, but there's a lot of ignorance. And to be honest with you, I have a full-time person who's just helping me on the data and technology piece. I myself don't understand half the stuff, So to expect, folks in the social sector and leadership suddenly to be able to understand what a data scientist can bring to their organization is a tough call. So, we were wanting, through this capacity building initiative, we could approach it in a way where you would have the right elements as a senior leader to understand the benefits, but wouldn't have to get into the weeds of things. But that work has been stalled a bit. The last piece I wanted to mention is also we've been having some very interesting conversations. And at one point of time, we started calling that group the Data Philanthropy Collaborative, but then we realized we had a few bilaterals over there, and we also had the private sector. So we haven't given ourselves a name. We're still saying a data collaborative. So, Ford, Gates, USAID, World Bank, Omidyar, and MasterCard have been part of those conversations. We've just done a quick survey to understand, what these different institutions really want to be seeing for this. I mean, I would want to say it's a very loose collaborative, so let's not kind of, assume anything here. So, for the want of a better word, of where we are very early on in our journey, but at least we're beginning to see that, many of us want to be playing an important role in this space. So let's not duplicate efforts. Let's kind of start mapping out what each one of us wants to do. And, if there's a possibility of us leveraging each other's work, great. But at least the least we can do is at least have visibility in terms of what overall do we want to do when it comes to looking at the ecosystem more broadly. So let me stop over here and hand it back to you, Ingrid.
Thank you, Deepali. I'm going to welcome Christopher Worman from TechSoup. Christopher, what we're trying to do, we're going around the room, introducing ourselves and talking about what our organization's philosophy has been to addressing some of the tech-related issues of the last, through this pandemic and its collateral crises. And while you sort of put your thoughts together on that, I'm going to go to George Aikara.
Thanks, Ingrid. I represent United Way Mumbai. We are an organization that works with companies and NGOs. In a year, typically in a year, we work with over 200 companies on their CSR grants, their employee payroll, the volunteering programs, and 600 odd NGOs in a year on different programs. Most of them are short-term implementations, but there are some programs which last multiple years. And we're usually known for our role as the philanthropy partners for the Mumbai Marathon, an event that raises around 40 crores every year for 300 odd NGOs. And our role has essentially been, with the work from home imposed on all of us, and typically the NGOs that we work with are smaller organizations, and there are large organizations as well, but who have all been struggling with this entire requirement to digitalize and go virtual. And in effect, I think the problem that is facing the civil society as such is a problem of access. Most of us have outdated machines, outdated software. We work on freeware. We look for pro bono support, which is not a structured support that we get. A lot of these grants that come through foundations and uh, grant making organizations do not have any provisions for capacity building on the tech front. There is some measure that is usually added in for measurement. And that is one area that we see there are a lot of digital providers now who bring in different types of apps and solutions, which essentially help you with the data collection part, the measurement part, and the analytics part, which is feedback. But at the operational level, there already exist a lot of softwares and solutions, whether it is for HR, managing, how to access data in your offices, how to work virtually. Zoom connections have limitations. They are also expensive. And I'm talking of NGOs for whom the Zoom subscription amount is also a huge, significant investment, even to work with the beneficiaries, and then all the other associated issues with beneficiaries not having data, not having machines. And so our learning and our learning in this crisis time and in our approach has been, of course, we've had to adopt as well. Consider we've taken help from all kinds of sources regarding digital security. There is an institute called the Cyber Peace Institute in Switzerland, which offers free pro bono support to NGOs on improving their data security, from the website, because all of us are adapted to work from home and accessing data and where it is stored, how it is done. And we had support from Microsoft in helping us set it up and evaluate these. So it's been an adoption process, I think, and we've tried to pass it on by getting employees of companies with specialized skills to help these organizations in pro bono capacities or through different ways to extend those skills, which companies take for granted, foundations already have, but for NGOs, having just access to expertise. Setting up Microsoft Teams is a hugely technical task. It's not like any other Slack or any other software. I've gone through that. So just having that person set this up for an organization is a huge help that organizations, companies can provide. And if we are in a position to facilitate that, that is what we try and do as much as possible. Also help with taking programs virtual. How do you, what you've been historically been doing in a physical setting, if you have to make it virtual, what are the things, what are the tools that you require, what are the protocols, how do you ensure security and all of that. So yeah, so a lot of it at our end has been just pure learning and trying to pass on that learning to as much as possible to as many NGOs. And frankly, it has been mostly towards free resources that are available online. And in India, we don't have as many, but in the Western world, there are so many, almost every organization that has a software as a service has a non-profit discount or an option, which is what we put together these options, and we take it to our network of NGOs and tell them, these are ways we have adapted. Social media, here's a tool, Google spreadsheets, this is how you do it, and training courses. So yeah, so that's been our effort in the crisis to try and enable tech capacity in the sector.
Thank you, George. Vikash, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thanks, Ingrid. Apologies, my bandwidth is a little low, so I won't be able to switch on the video. Um, Hi, I'm Vikash. I currently work for an agri-tech firm called Kamatan. And prior to this role, I was working for a not-for-profit called Will Grow Innovation Foundations, where um, we work with for-profit market-led solutions, early-stage enterprises who can help build scalable solution for the masses. And I can share both perspective because I made this shift very recently to this agri-tech firm. So kind of have seen both parts of um, uh, from a grant making perspective as well as from a beneficiary perspective, what are the challenges that came up. So first, starting from Wilgrow, I think internally we were quite well prepared because we had developed an internal communication system called Vitals, which was we embarked on that journey, I think, in the March of 2019, and we were almost 80% through. So that helped us a lot in terms of structuring our information and other stuff. Um, but just to reiterate the point, we are trying to provide that platform for all the other incubators who are also trying to manage their data well. And it's still an inward-looking system. We are also thinking, how do we make it externally available for all the grantees that we have? So that process, I think, got accelerated by the COVID, and we are kind of trying to open it up as soon as possible, at least partial access to all our grantees. I think from a Wilgrow perspective, the second thing, because we work with very early stage enterprises who are all innovation led and tech led enterprises, what we faced as a challenge was a challenge of survival. I think most of these enterprises in their early stages run on a very tight budget. So I think more than anything else, we focused a lot on just getting them to survive this phase, and which meant three things. Number one, to keep a tight control and a pulse of their finances. That was number one. And of course, to arrange grants if possible. The second was to pivot in case their business model was completely disrupted. For example, one of our grantees works with domestic help in India, and their business model was completely disrupted. So how do we find alternate source of revenues? How do we pivot them and create a mechanism for them to survive this pandemic? And the third was, of course, to help retain the talent, right? That was critical because these are small teams, and one person leaving can cause huge damage for the survivability of the enterprise. Fortunately, all the grantees that we have did see through the pandemic, and some of them have completely pivoted their business model. So I think the key takeaway there is probably the flexibility in a smaller organization is higher, and that allowed them to survive through this pandemic. Larger organization or a slightly later stage organization faced more challenges than ones who were still in the product development stage or a commercial pilot stage. This was largely from the Wilgrow perspective. I think from the agri-tech firm where I'm currently working, there has been a lot of disruption due to the policy changes announced, favorable policy changes announced. But of course, there's a little bit of a communication gap on the ground, and that's where our firm decided to accelerate the process of development of a farmer app, as well as a solution for FPO digitization. So just to clarify, we primarily try to work through the FPOs and then connect to the farmers, which itself is a very, very nascent kind of idea in the agri-tech ecosystem. So these two processes got accelerated. From a consumer behavior perspective, we were greatly surprised by the kind of responses that we got from the farmers. I think in our initial estimation of product development, the kind of targets that we had for the responses that we would see from the farmers um, was slightly conservative, and we saw all those targets being achieved. So there was the signal that we read was there was willingness from their side to use digital and make their lives better, or use it to um, increase their business, or whatever they want to do. But maybe the solutions were not tailored for their particular use case. So in a way, COVID for us in the agri-tech space has definitely given an impetus to product adoption among the farmers, and we are continuously working on trying to provide them the right solutions. So yeah, I think that's been our learning. I'll take a pause here. Ingrid, over to you.
Thank you, Vikash. And finally, Chris.
Sure, thanks. And again, sorry to be late. A couple of things. So this question about sort of our philosophy might be couched in what we did. And so right when the pandemic hit, for those of you who don't know, TechSoup, traditionally we help NGOs get and use technology. Currently, we're working with about 1.6 million NGOs across all non-US embargoed countries. So everywhere Americans are allowed to work. And about 83% of those, are 5 people or less. So we're very focused on grassroots civil society. And what we saw super early on in the pandemic was a surge in NGOs coming to TechSoup looking for educational support in security and remote work processing. How do they manage this shift to remote work? What we saw, and when I say surge, our online courses platform, TechSoup Courses, if you Google it, we have about 150 courses that are really by NGOs for NGOs on tech topics. We went from about 9,000 active monthly users to more than 50,000 users in the span of a month. So this incredible explosion coming from about 140 countries around the world looking for security, which before COVID, it was almost impossible to get NGOs to talk about digital security, especially little ones, and now they were seeking it. So we very quickly started designing a bunch of additional educational resources. We did a fundraiser for a fund to underwrite the cost of technology for small and medium-sized social service organizations who are at risk of going out of business during COVID as they tried to pivot to remote work and services, making sure that of all the things that could drive them out of business, technology wouldn't be the one. So we raised about $5 million, and we've been distributing that in essentially micro grants, reimbursing people for products like Zoom that was just mentioned. We ran a big research project to which Ingrid and the team very kindly participated in. We distributed that late this summer. We received about 33,000 responses to this survey about primarily data handling, how organizations were thinking about and working on data handling as they went to remote work and services, how they were thinking about digital transformation and what COVID had done to that. A couple of points that I would raise there: more than 70% of the NGOs who responded noted that they'd been forced to adopt new technologies that they were not planning on, and they are not going back. They believe that those changes will be permanent. Did they have a plan? No. 75% of the NGOs responding to our survey did not have a digital strategy, and about 72% of them did not have any technical support and have never had any technical support. Those two things should be deeply concerning to all of us. They are now handling more and more vital data about disenfranchised, marginal communities without any training, without support, without plans, and policies. So all of those things, like there's a lot of work that we all need to do to help support this really major shift that has happened. Another thing we did, and then I'll quickly mention why we care and then stop talking. Another thing we did was looking at all of this and thinking critically about how we could have been better prepared, how we could have not ended up in this moment of pain. And the very clear answer was that we lack digital infrastructures for civil society. Big surprise. Like, I don't think that's a surprise to any of us. What do we mean by digital infrastructures? And so I started crafting a model looking at a minimum viable digital infrastructure for civil society as a combination of the internet, you have to have it, the policies, the national level policies that make using the internet safe, the skills to use the internet, the tools to use the internet, and learning communities to help us keep working with and evolving our relationship to technology. So any one of those, all of those 5 things, you kind of have to have them to have a productive relationship with the digital world and digitalization of societies. Take away any one of them and things fall apart. And around that model started convening 2 very high-level working groups, one at World Economic Forum on ending the digital divide, and one with a group of large American foundations who I keep trying to think more internationally. That's a little struggle sometimes with American foundations, as some of you know. Rockefeller aside, you guys are great, but a lot of the other ones, helping them think about sort of the tone that they set in international philanthropy and their commitment to these principles and how they have a ripple effect. But both of those working groups, a lot of, I think, really exciting work there as people try to grapple with some large long-term bets on infrastructure that we need to be successful as civil society through digitalization. And then the last thing sort of, so that was a bunch of stuff we did. I'm sure I missed a bunch of things that especially our partner network did around the world and things that we will be doing with all the data we gathered. Why do we care? Couple of reasons. One, this is a precursor to what's coming. Ingrid has heard me speak to the Wings board, which we're both members of, and in other places, about the fact that the cloud is coming. It is non-negotiable. In 5 to 7 years, we will all be in the cloud, period. Because Microsoft will end Microsoft on-premise, which is used by more than 95% of global civil society, governments, and businesses. When that happens, we must be in the cloud. They're going to do it for business reasons. The net impact of that is that if we're not in the cloud, our services start to degrade. We have to work on all of this, moving civil society and the rest of us towards the cloud, whether we like it or not. This moment has been teaching us a lot about exactly what that looks like if we're not there. So that's part of why we care. The other reason we care is grassroots civil society. It's the front line. It's the last line. There is no social safety net beneath civil society. If your local community mental health provider fails and they're the only provider in many communities, who's left to help you? That is a reality that we are uniquely positioned to see because of the breadth of our reach, and get very concerned about how we help those organizations digitalize, begin managing their data, and begin networking their data so that we can, as we move through digitalization as society, bring otherwise invisible communities along with us. So we care very deeply about the representational capacity of civil society and what is to be gained by society should they be able to express themselves with data and evidence towards some of the policy making that has to happen and happens, as we all know, often in a room without any real grassroots evidence. So there's a lot in that space that we care very much about the success of the digitalization of civil society and building some of the sorts of tools, processes, support mechanisms that ensure that the littlest NGOs are as able to participate as anybody else. So I'll stop there. Might drop a couple of links in the chat to some examples of that, just because I said a lot of things. And, you know, I would have to say it's been a crazy time for all of us. My hair used to be amazing like Ingrid's, and now look at me. It's crazy.
Each of you, I mean, it's been a fantastically rich kind of experience for me, just to hear the range of activities and the range of initiatives that across this small group has kicked off. So I'm going to try I noticed we have less than 30 minutes left. So I'm going to try and factor analyze what we've been talking about and sort of club what I see as emerging themes. I think the overriding theme I'm hearing is one of momentum. there is finally, belatedly, a realization of the value and the need to adopt technology. And we need to figure out collectively as a community how we're going to build on that momentum. This within sub-themes within that, if you will, is one is I think there's a clear need to build some sort of platform where people can simply find all of the resources that are out there. So while TechSoup has its whole menu, it's a very long menu of products and services that are available to civil society, there are dozens of others, perhaps not as large as TechSoup, but which are providing a whole range of solutions that George and others talked about. So perhaps we need to sort of almost, maybe CSIP can do this, create a little microsite that simply links you to all of the various resources that are available. And I'm seeing resources in terms of not just products and services available, but examples of successful initiatives, learning. If I want to know more about AI for social good, where do I go? Leads in terms of partners I could be accessing to find out more or to build partnerships, open source products and that I could explore, as well as resources on things like data regulation and the more policy aspects of this. The other element, I think, other sub-theme, if you will, is simply to be able to put out examples of funding, how funding practices have changed. We heard from Empower and I know from Vidya and from a lot of you, how you've pivoted to more flexible emergency funding. Lots of you mentioned this change of your funding practices. And I think it's really important, I think, for the philanthropic community more broadly, to be able to see fellow philanthropists who are making this transition. The third sub-theme, I think, is one around collaboratives. Deepali mentioned a few, Chris mentioned a few. And so really, if we can, at CSIP, simply almost be a traffic warden, that points people at, well, if that's what you're looking for, here's the collaborative that might be able to help you on this. But if all of you can really contribute to saying, here are some networks that you might want to join if you're a nonprofit. Here are some networks you might want to join if you're a philanthropist. Here are some networks you might want to join if you're an intermediary. I think that would be another sort of useful resource. But I think also maybe we want to just spend a few minutes thinking about other collaborative initiatives that have been sparked off by the conversation we've had today. And finally, I think there's a sub-theme around messaging. I mean, I think this, all of what we've spoken about, I didn't know 95% of what I heard today. I was hearing it for the first time, and I like to fancy that I listen quite intently to what's going on in this space. So is there a need really for more concerted, either individual organizations or collectives, to put out some serious communication, maybe even more sort of nudge-oriented communication, and we could bring in another center of Ashoka that specializes in that to work with us on this. WPP does work on this, but really to look at what can we do to, I don't want to use the phrase push people over the edge, but you know what I mean, push people over the edge to adopt technology with all the safeguards that they need. And finally, the last sub-theme really is the whole domain of policy. What needs to change policy-wise to make the ecosystem more enabling for people to know about, to adopt, and to use technology in a way that's safe for them and for their constituents. So I'm going to open the floor now. We have about 20 minutes. Open the floor for one. Does this sound like a reasonable summary of what we discussed? And is there something that you want to add by way of themes or sub-themes? And second is, I'm looking really for a show of hands, if you will, for people who say, look, I'm really interested in the messaging piece of this, and I want to do more work on this. So two things, additional topics and volunteers to sign up for some of these sub-themes. Are we going to go around the room again, or should I just cold call people? Let's go back to where we started. Let's start with Vidya.
I think, Ingrid, from me, hearing all the people, especially Chris and George and Vikas, I think it's amazing the amount of work that's already gone on, and the fact that one is just not aware. I think somebody else on the chat also put that comment that we're always struggling to figure out what's going on. And that some of the effort we are now making is to really provide both funding as well as really good support to our organizations. We're looking at 100 NGOs that we can support over the next 2 years, 2 years at least, specifically on capacity building, and looking at just 3 areas, basically technology, HR, and finance, and that kind of the financial accounting and reporting kind of work. And therefore, so if this platform is something that we can get to know more about the other participants, especially on this call, it'll be fantastic, because we've been struggling, figure out where to go, who to go to, who's the best person to, Donald Lobo and his Tech for Dev is also a great organization. So we've been talking to him. And it'll be really great to figure out the collaborative part of what you were speaking about is something that interests me a lot.
So a mapping of the available resources, as well as an ability, a hub where you can actually connect with.
Yeah.
Thanks, Vidya. Who was I going to go to next? Rama.
Yeah. Okay, I almost felt that you were looking at me when you were talking about the messaging. So, but no. But I would like to sort of see if we can pick that up later, and maybe pick it up offline, because I do believe it's a huge part, that's needed. Again, very similar to what Vidya is saying, we really struggled, and I think we learned by trial and error. I still believe that we did things because we had to in the time that we had to. I'm not sure if we even formed the best partnerships. There were a lot of basic processes, like we have a huge diligence process that we go through. We had to circumvent a lot of those processes because we just had to be out there and in time to just access our beneficiaries. So, when I heard Chris, I was just saying, oh my God, we didn't even know that kind of a service existed. One of the things that we found interesting, so firstly, I do believe you summarized it really well. In fact, there's been a couple of value adds also, which, we probably could spend some time talking about maybe some other time. But one of the things that we found is that at a time during COVID, maybe I think it brought the best of innovation. Even the existing players were willing to completely relook their models and relearn. So I haven't seen this level of willing to sort of unlearn and learn again. We found that social enterprise is a segment that we had never really looked at, and they have a huge amount to offer, and there can be some great partnerships to form over there. So if you could literally have like a marketplace where you have where you literally have people who are willing to donate not just funds, but also their resources and their people towards building this entire sort of ecosystem that we need. And we literally need to have not only NGOs, but also social enterprise as part of it, because I think it's the first time I saw civil society and social enterprise talking to each other. One of the partners that we've worked with, who's building a couple of WhatsApp bots for us, is a social enterprise. And it's just a conversation we had. They found this whole space interesting and they're willing to pilot with us. So, and in a normal situation, we would have never gone down that route. We would have just looked at civil society and sort of, we have that entire ecosystem and we have a database that we sort of work with. But we found that willing to relearn is a huge sort of mood that is there right now. And I think we should find ways to sort of cash in on that.
Thanks, Rama. I'm going to go back to Nishana.
Hi. I need to show you, I'm in learning mode. I've been taking notes while everyone was speaking. But yeah, I mean, I think that this has been really, really eye-opening. But one potential addition that I would like to add is actually to look at the digital divide. I think for all of us who are working in the civil society space, especially those of us who are working in the civil society space, we need to look at uptake and barriers to entry for a lot of not only the NGO partners that we're working with, but also the program participants on the ground. So that and that digital divide also includes addressing power, which is what I was alluding to earlier, right? Is how are you going to make all of the unlearning and relearning that we've done, all of the innovation that is resulting. I mean, there is a massive silver lining that exists as a consequence of us moving online, and it's opening up a lot of potential. But who is that potential actually opening up to, and who is being left behind? And with all innovation, it's often those, they often lay bare existing inequalities, right? So I think part of this is like part of that collaborative piece is, what are the tools and strategies that we can collectively come up with to bridge that divide, and consequently also bridge or attempt to minimize existing inequalities. And I think that conversation, is best addressed through collective intelligence and collaborative. So I think that this would be an ideal space to talk about that.
Thank you, Nisha. Coming to Paresh now.
Sure. Thanks, Ingrid. I think I would really kind of emphasize and maybe leave a couple more thoughts. One is when you talked about messaging, I think putting out communication. Uh, uh, I think a lot of our work today is really thinking about how will technology get adopted when it gets introduced in areas that see that digital divide that Nisha referred to. And so we are really thinking hard about saying when we apply the principles of behavior change, those apply in a programmatic sense. Can it also be applied in the space of technology adoption? Uh, and I don't know whether, Ingrid, you are referring to CSBC when you talked about the arm of Ashoka, which works in that space. But I think hearing some of the work that they have been doing, that might be an interesting thing to add on as to how can the role of behavior change help improve the adoption of technology. The second is, I think, when it comes to, and I talked about some of our platform-based approaches, what we call internally our big bets, uh, and the development of some of these platforms, whether it is for electronic health records, whether it is for monitoring and control in the water space. Uh, I think the challenge that we seem to be facing increasingly is the availability of talent. And when I say availability of talent, unlike I think many parts of the social sector ecosystem, here we are really vying for talent, not within the sector, not with the corporate sector, but really with the tech sector. I think the way the tech sector is developing, we end up losing talent. Now, how do we really develop? The question is, how do we not just attract talent, but develop a model that can really leverage the skills wherever they reside, whether it is within the tech industry or whether it is within the gig industry, or whether it is freelancers who can come along and work with this sector. How can we really leverage that talent that exists? Uh, the third element is when you talked about policy and grid, I don't know whether it is also to, in a sense, cover how should non-profits be, in a sense, sensitized and made ready to comply with existing regulations. I think the understanding of compliance, and so what is it that non-profits and the boards of a lot of these non-profits need to do to really meet up with the increasing requirements around regulation is possibly an area that I would do the entire kind of
and what's the
aggregation
about
here.
that, Paresh?
And the one that I would emphasize on you, I'm sorry?
What's the tech angle on that? Are you saying simply that there needs to be a platform where this is easily accessible?
So like some of the programs that you would run or that ILSS would run, require understand compliance requirements. That can you hear me?
Now we can. We lost you for a minute there.
Okay. So I was just saying, Ingrid, like some of the programs that you run at CSIP or what ILSS does, is there a need for running, let's say, short programs, to get nonprofits and the boards and trustees understand the compliance requirements around data, around tech, in the context of the emerging regulatory framework? And the one that I would emphasize on, you talked about collaboratives. I think how can we really make some of these platforms open source and in a manner that can be used not just by someone who's developing them, but which can actually be deployed on the cloud, like Chris said, and maintaining the privacy around confidentiality around data, which is specific to each organization. So I think collaboratives is something that we've always believed in. We're kind of talking about that in our own way, both for tech and for programmatic. But yeah, I mean, that's something I would definitely be very keen on.
Thanks, Paresh. Who did I have next? Deepali.
Yeah, thanks, Ingrid, and I agree with everything that's been said. I just want to emphasize the importance of data, big data. And I think, all of us across the civil society space are collecting so much of data, but, there's a real issue about the quality of data and how we're putting that to use. And also, going forward, does everybody need to collect that data, or do we have enough, but we're not just sharing that with each other? And what's preventing us? Because, there's so much that technology can do in terms of predictive analysis. I mean, I gave examples around demand for data. I mean, we know Netflix, we all have Netflix accounts. We just open our Netflix account and we know exactly, we're told which films we should be watching, right? So how can we kind of provide that similar feature to a health worker? As soon as she opens up a mobile phone, all the data that she's entered, that tells her exactly these are the 3 high-risk mothers, or these are the 4 kids, forget going door to door and kind of meeting up everybody to figure out. But, through the data analysis that's been done, what, where and how you should be spending your time. I guess also one does worry about, the kind of burden you would create by, getting all civil society actors. I mean, in a perfect world where we had endless resources, it makes perfect sense and everybody kind of comes to a level where, they have a fairly good understanding. But one has also been thinking, can we have intermediary organization that can really be playing that role of helping some of the smaller organizations where everybody doesn't have to necessarily beef up all their capabilities and capacities, but what are the necessary aspects that they have to build the capacity, but where can intermediary institutions come in and, if they can really collate the data across different data sets, which is just not being utilized, but suddenly you have access to big data and you can run your algorithms and be able to tell each one of them, hey, these are the weather patterns, this is where, agriculture, whatever, this is the predictive pieces on health, on energy, just about everything, I mean, that for me is something that, would be really extremely useful. And there are organizations who are prepared to do that. So, how do we kind of actually have those conversations where we kind of are able to see what the interest is, and those of us who are really interested in supporting that, could also be an interesting way of how we can really make a significant contribution.
This is something that Rohini Nilekani just wrote about on Rohini and Nandan actually jointly authored an article on this societal platform concept, which relates quite closely to what you're saying. So maybe we should be pulling them into this conversation as well. And then, what do I have next? George.
So a couple of points, Ingrid, I completely agree with every point that you made. There are very few organizations who are looking at the entire ecosystem. Most funders, most large grantors look at the pool of organizations. And those organizations already have cleared the due diligence level, standards, etc. But for the larger sector, whether it is policy, and by policy, I mean representing the rights of the community and the ecosystem, and providing access. So to your larger point of having a single point source where you could be pointing people in the direction of resources that they require. And everything that Chris mentioned, in fact, TechSoup has been the backbone of the entire social sector by the product donations. I don't know how we would have developed to the state that we have without those donations that TechSoup has provided all these years. And there are platforms like that which are available. There are some restrictions on FCRA, whether you have or don't have, and you may or may not be eligible. But having a single point source which allows you a reference point in the sector, a lodestar where you need to go and check where should I go next, where am I? And one key thing that keeps getting missed out is at the end of the day, as part of the larger access issue, is that you also need a human being to support them, especially Chris mentioned so many NGOs with less than 5 people in the team, and they're predominantly working on programs. So to spare that, and you actually technically need somebody to even help them access those resources and make them real in that sense, and collaboration, of course. So for my part, of course, I'm happy to extend any kind of help I can. We bootstrapped all our way through this. We figured out whatever we need from where we could, and we've tried to share that. And if that is something of value, happy to do that.
So with 7 or 8 minutes left, Vikash, and then Chris.
Sure. No, again, I think most of the points have been covered. I think just one additional thought that I had was a little bit of awareness building as this tech penetration and data penetration happens. Um, a personal observation has been the correct usage by the end beneficiary. I think as there's a lot of ways in which tech can be used, but can we do something to educate people to tell them how to use the technology in the best possible way, which is to say, like just doing a comparison, it can be used for one device can be used for educating a child, but it can also be used by the family to watch an OTT content. So how do we kind of like segregate good usage of tech as the penetration increases versus kind of maybe not the adverse, but not so good use of tech. I think there is an opportunity along with this momentum to build that awareness in all segments of society. And from a contribution perspective, I'm more than happy to contribute in any of the fields if I can. But of course, from what I have worked in, more than happy to work on how funding practices have changed and how we can learn from each other, and we can also use more innovative approaches that are happening across the globe, and can serve the purpose in India as well. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Christopher, you get to go last.
Thanks. And so much richness in this discussion. I've been dropping some, one-ups and thumbs ups in the chat there. I think a couple of things that I think it is high time that we do as a community. The messaging point, I think, is super critical, especially thinking about this as common messaging, common narrative around the end game. What are we all trying to achieve? Rather than all of us trying to achieve it on our own, this point about how do we collaborate and coordinate came up. that is possible if we know and agree on where we're trying to go. And so doing some decent sort of design thinking and workshopping about what is it we're actually trying to do, to the point that came up about internet access with the World Economic Forum Working Group. We've taken the World Wide Web Foundation, all the internet for all the people all the time. What will it take to achieve that? You know, and you can work backwards from that statement, and civil society is going to be right in the middle of it, because you said all, and there's no way this happens without civil society if we're talking about all the people. So I think that sort of work around messaging to help us orient. Another thing I would say, messaging civil society as a service economy, not a beneficiary, not as something weak or lesser, but the strengths that we have and we have demonstrated during this crisis as a way to help reconfirm and reestablish ourselves in the space, in, you know, the anti-closing space reality. And again, as an economy, we are a $4 trillion sector. We are the size of Germany. We employ 290 million people, staff or volunteers. This is not an insignificant part of the globe. And we need to stand up and represent that and fight for it, because good luck doing it without us. And then the last thing I think I would say is on some critical thinking about the behaviors that we've changed during this, and mapping them, you know, sitting down and talking about how has philanthropy changed? How have operations changed? What's good about that? What's bad about it? What do we want to maintain? What do we want to let go? Because we have all made changes. We've been forced to make changes. Some of those are good changes. If we don't respect them, annotate them, and institutionalize them, we'll go right back to the way we were before this. And in some cases, that would be a blessing. God knows. I kind of like 2019. It looks pretty good right now. But there are a lot of pieces that have gotten better, and they're changes that we had to make. So really thinking about how we institutionalize those and don't just go back. So I would, that's it. Policy would be another fine point just on, I think on digital rights. I appreciate the point that was raised about making sure people know how to comply with existing policies. I think we also need to up our game between the frontline digital rights thinkers and the rest of civil society, and helping grassroots NGOs understand that digital rights are their fight too. They will be tomorrow if they're not today. So how do we increase that sensitivity so that we end up getting some of the digital rights that we need for civil society and for social benefit, not for Facebook?
I know our second keynote speaker, Apar Gupta, will be speaking to this tomorrow evening. But thank you. I have been hugely educated over the last, over the session, and each of you has been, I mean, I'm literally gobsmacked with the amount of value and content that you people have been adding. Thank you for participating. Thank you to all the people viewing this on YouTube and